Therapy. Cobb had been sitting in the waiting room of Dr. Bluett's office for 10 minutes or so. It was long enough to make him uncomfortable. He fidgeted with his hands. He tugged at the knotted cotton underwear pinching into his groin. He looked out the window. He looked at the wall hangings, which were just a few prints and some of those hokey expressions that people put up. Those moronic feel-good things that really make no sense unless you're suicidal or something like that. Cobb went to see the therapist Patty set up twice a month for an hour. She was expensive, not the usual Canada Corrections employee filling a day for a guaranteed pay stub. But he was on the Queen's ticket. It wasn't an out-of-pocket expense for him. She only saw a few people from the penal community. It was a small part of her practice. Giving back, she called it. She was a professional acquaintance of Paddy Papes, and she spoke highly of Paddy, a man she described as dedicated to the betterment of the marginalized. Cobb loved that word, marginalized. It was laced with the guilt of semi-aware white people, but white people nonetheless, and it had helped him out numerous times in court through his adolescence. "Your Honor," the legal aid lawyer would say, "my client is part of a marginalized people." Or at a sentencing hearing, "Your Honor, we would ask the court that Mr. Seymour be given a sentence that reflects his status as a marginalized Canadian." Dr. Bluett bought in heavy to the whole marginalized thing. Why wouldn't she? She made a whack of dough for doing next to nothing, and she did it on the backs of the marginalized. She was a nice enough white woman, but dumb as a stone. It always amazed Cobb how smart and how stupid white people could be at the same time. Dr. Bluett had absolutely no sense of the world behind the world. She thought dreams were the indigestion of the psyche, and she didn't believe in a spirit like Cobb's that could walk into the invisible planes and be given work by an entity like Crow. Cobb was merciful with her. He didn't make any trouble. His only condition with Paddy was that the sessions be on work time, not evening time. So he actually looked forward to them. One session could get him out of the sewers for a whole afternoon. Cobb did no preliminary work on Dr. Bluett. No tracking, no surveillance, no documentation. She didn't have any real power over him, but he did take advantage of the access to information her office provided him. Dr. Bluett kept all her files in cabinets in her office. She had drawers full of tape-recorded sessions with patients, going back as far as 10 years. It was the perfect place for Cobb to get more information on the white man, furthering his unofficial research into the worst creature the Creator had ever made. There was no security whatsoever beyond a locked door. It was tougher to break into Paddy's place. At least he had a dog. Cobb never expected to find a file on PC Richard Chase. There were other cops Dr. Bluett had seen over the years. She was, after all, something of a specialist on the psychology of people in the justice system. And, from what Cobb learned in the files, there wasn't a whole lot of difference in the mental health of those who lived behind the bars and those who locked and unlocked the bars. Both suffered from what Dr. Bluett called a victim consciousness. It took Cobb a few minutes of reading the cop's file to realize he was the second and last of the cops he had knocked out in Parkdale. Knocking out cops had lost its appeal for Cobb. He had a business to run, but he did write down Chase's home address and phone number. Cobb read all the notes on Chase and listened to 10 hours of tapes over 7 late-night break-ins. Dr. Bluett had prescribed them both the same drug, Zolfax. It was a trial drug. Cobb and Chase didn't have to pay for it. Cobb sold his on the street. There was good money in pills. And the white man's mind medicine was pure poison, a gateway to the demonic underworld. The notes and tapes revealed that the Metro Toronto Police Force had its own full-time psychiatrist, but PC Richard Chase wanted to go outside the force. There was a strange way in which things said in confidence in any place where the Blue Shield Society existed made their way into the ears of that body blue in its totality. Cops gossiped. They could be terribly cruel. The week after he got out of the hospital, there was a lollipop and a keychain with a scream button taped to the inside of his locker. Cops backed each other up, no doubt, but if you lost your badge, you lost your dignity, your camaraderie, your place at the table. You couldn't show up at the pub for beers, nachos, and body tails. You couldn't brag, and cops loved to brag. How could you brag when some scumbag on the street had your badge, was showing it to his friends, flashing it about town, maybe even using it to fake being a cop himself? It was a horror story. There were the other things too. The pins in his jaw, the headaches, the bad dreams, and the fear. The fear was the worst thing of all. In his first year on the force, there was a cop who got jumped and beaten, and he had gotten the fear. His brothers and sisters in blue compared it to a high steel worker who lost his nerve. There were men, according to these urban stories, who could work high steel all their lives, from 18 years old onward. Then, one day, with no warning, they lost their nerve. They found themselves out on a ledge, unable to move, frozen, suddenly intimately aware of how high up they were, of what a fall from that height would do to them. A closed casket, teeth scattered for a block, gold fillings washed into a sewer in the next big rain. And they just sat there, frozen by fear. They didn't cry for help. They didn't ask someone to come over. They just sat there. When the work they were doing in the chain of work went undone, and it became obvious to everyone that there was a hole in the work circle because things weren't closing, supplies were building up, and the crane operator found himself hanging a load with nobody coming over to unhook it, and the blue sky seemed omnipresent, then they would start looking for the hole in the circle, the frozen man on a beam of steel in the middle of the sky. Then, as the cops like to tell their tale, a Mohawk was needed. The Mohawks never lost their nerve. It wasn't something they acquired, they were born with it. They were the best high steel workers in the world. Nature had given them an unassailable confidence in the sky, bolstering the myth of an eagle as spirit guide, guardian of the sky, the high ground, the omnipresence. Chase was a frozen high steel worker waiting for a Mohawk to find him. He hadn't been on the street since he got knocked out, since his jaw got broken, since his badge got stolen, his shirt torn, and his dignity snuffed like a candle on a canoe. He was living on a disability pension. Chase wasn't much for the sentimental, the consciously sensitive, the overly empathetic, and rightly so. He watched the worst scum in society on a day-by-day basis. He cleaned bodies off the road. He arrived at apartments where husbands had knocked out wives, and wives had stabbed husbands, and dogs had been poisoned, and children had been beaten and maltreated, and all other manner of human sickness that came from the unflinching commitment to a broken moment, people welded by anger to misperception, violence, and insanity. Dr. Bluett wrote that people like Chase were initiated into the nonsense of human existence, the complete lack of sense, and there was no turning back. In the absence of any kind of grander insight into human nature, people like Chase were left with the details, all the little facts that corroborated no theories, theologies, or theosophies. It was horrible, according to Dr. Bluett, and the only thing that kept the horror at bay was the constant momentum of being a cop. Stop thinking, just act. That's how they did it. They worked so hard they didn't have to think about it. But when the momentum got broken, as it did when Chase's jaw got broken, the horror was there. The sum of detail without conclusion to the equation of human behavior. It was horrible for a cop to be frozen. The door opened and a large woman in a flowing gown, more like a cotton tarp thrown over her body, a big tent that an unashamed fat person would wear, smiled warmly at Cobb. She had salt and pepper hair that puffed out like an afro. There were 3 sets of beads around her neck. She looked like a witch doctor. She gestured for Cobb to come forward. He looked at the office receptionist, who had been sitting in the waiting room the whole time with him, silent and indifferent to him, and she said, "The doctor will see you now." Cobb got up and walked over to the office door. End of chapter.